That's the first thing anyone learns about Dead Holler. The county quits maintaining the blacktop about 6 miles out, then the gravel quits, then the dirt quits, until you're following something that used to be a wagon trace and now looks more like a wound in the mountainside. Rhododendron claws overhead so thick the sun comes down in needles. You smell it before you see it, sweet and wrong, like ham left out in July. The letter reached the free clinic on a Tuesday that smelled of snow even though it was only October. It came in a plain envelope with no stamp, just the clinic's address scrawled in a hand that shook so badly the ink bled into brown smears. Inside was a single sheet of paper the color of weak tea, so thin the light showed through it like skin. Someone had written the same sentence again and again until the pen tore holes. She ain't right no more. Come quick. Dead Holler. Under that, a name Eula Mae Crutchfield written once, careful and large, as though the writer had to borrow steadiness from somewhere deep. The clinic had one midwife willing to go where cell phones died and roads turned their backs on maps. Her name was Ruth Caldecott, 33, raised in Charleston, trained in Pittsburgh, stubborn enough to believe distance and poverty were the worst things a person could face in a birthing room. She'd delivered breech babies in trailers with no running water, cut cords by headlamp while dogs barked at haints on the porch. She kept a calm voice and a packed bag and a habit of telling herself nothing could surprise her anymore. She was wrong, but she didn't know it yet. Ruth read the letter twice, then folded it into the pocket of her coat. The clerk who handed it over wouldn't meet her eyes. Everyone in Beckley knew about Dead Holler the way sailors know about certain patches of ocean. You don't go there unless something drags you. The Crutchfields had lived up that crease in the mountain since before the Civil War, marrying cousins when outsiders stopped coming, working seams of coal so thin only children and desperation could fit. The family dwindled the way candles do, slow and sooty, until only Eula Mae was left. Folks said she hadn't come down to the county seat in 15 years. Folks said a lot of things. Ruth filled her truck with gas, blankets, antibiotics, and the quiet certainty that someone needed help. She left before dawn, following directions scribbled on the back of the envelope, past the last church, left at the rusted school bus, straight until the mountain swallows the sky. The higher she climbed, the narrower the world grew, laurel thick as conspirators, creek water the color of tobacco spit. By the time the trace pinched down to 2 ruts and a prayer, the radio had surrendered to static that sounded like breathing. She told herself it was just another call. She told herself a lot of things on that drive. None of them would survive the night. The house appeared the way a bruise appears, suddenly, though it had been darkening under the skin for hours. Ruth eased the truck to a stop where the trace simply gave up, swallowed by a yard of packed red clay gone soft as lung tissue from weeks of rain. The dog-trot cabin crouched ahead, 2 pens joined by an open breezeway, roof sagging like an old dog too tired to hold its head up. Paint had long since flaked away, leaving the boards the color of a week-old corpse. Every window was dark, yet the place felt watched. She smelled the rot first, thick, wet, sweet in the way that makes the throat close. Not outhouse rot, not hogpen rot, something older, patient, the smell of fruit left in a cradle until it forgets its own shape. Ruth stepped out, boots sinking, and saw the graves. 7 low mounds in a crooked line between the porch and the woods, each no longer than her forearm. River stones marked the heads, smooth and pale, arranged not randomly but with care, like someone had stood over them night after night turning them to catch the moon just so. No names, no dates. Only stones and earth that refused to settle. In places the clay had cracked open, revealing black soil beneath that looked damp even though it hadn't rained in days. The front door hung ajar. A single rocking chair moved though there was no wind, creaking forward and back with the slow rhythm of breathing. Ruth's hand found the flashlight in her coat pocket, thumb resting on the switch but not pressing yet. She called out once, professional, steady, the voice she used for frightened mothers and drunks with knives. No answer came, only the wet drag of something heavy shifting inside the house. Then she saw Eula Mae. The woman stood in the dog-trot's shadows, one hand braced against a post, the other cradling a belly so monstrously swollen it seemed to pull her forward, bending her spine into a question mark. She wore a feedsack dress once floral, now the color of dishwater, stretched so tight the seams had split and been crudely laced with twine. Her hair hung in greasy ropes the shade of creek silt. Bare feet, black-soled and crusted, spread wide for balance on the puncheon floor. Ruth's training took over. She catalogued advanced pregnancy, possible multiples, malnutrition, probable infection, isolation psychosis. But beneath the clinical inventory ran a colder current. Eula Mae's eyes were open yet filmed, the pale grey of fish left on ice, and they fixed on Ruth with a recognition that felt centuries older than either of them. From somewhere inside the left-hand room came a soft sound, half sigh, half slurp, like a mouth trying to remember how to speak. Eula Mae's lips parted in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth gone the color of walnut hulls. "You came," she said, voice soft as mold. "Good. It's near time." She patted the vast curve of her stomach with proprietary pride, and beneath the thin dress something long and jointed moved in answer, pressing outward until the skin blanched white, then slowly subsided, leaving a print like a hand too large for any child ever born. Ruth stayed the first night on the porch because the house itself would not let her cross the threshold until Eula Mae decided she was ready. She sat on the top step with her back to the wall, knees drawn up, coat pulled tight against the cold that came up from the ground like fever. The woman moved inside with the slow certainty of something that has never needed to hurry, lighting no lamp, humming under her breath a tune that had no recognizable melody, only a wet, dragging cadence like boots through swamp water. In the dark the graves glowed faintly, the river stones catching starlight the way certain fungi catch it, a sickly phosphorescence that outlined each small mound. Ruth told herself it was Foxfy, nothing more, but she kept her eyes on the yard all the same. Near midnight Eula Mae came to the doorway and spoke without looking at Ruth, as if addressing the night itself. "They told you I killed em, didn't they? Down in the flatland." Her voice carried the mountain in it, vowels stretched thin, consonants soft as rot. "Told you I birthed em wrong and buried em quick so the state wouldn't take the rest." Ruth said nothing. She had heard versions of the story on the drive up: poison in the well, husband run off or murdered, woman gone queer in the head and smothering babies one after another. The usual cruelties people pin on anyone who refuses their pity. Eula Mae stepped onto the porch. The boards did not creak beneath her, they sighed, as though relieved to take her weight again. She lowered herself beside Ruth with the care of a much older woman, belly resting on her thighs like a separate creature. "They wasn't never all the way alive," she said, "and they wasn't never all the way dead. That's the part folks can't swallow. They come out cold, blue as creek clay, veins black instead of red. Eyes already clouded. But they breathe. Slow, like a bellows with a hole in it, but they breathe. And they know me." She placed Ruth's hand on the side of her stomach without asking. Ruth started to pull away, then froze. Beneath the skin something shifted, not a kick but a deliberate pressing, a palm spread wide, fingers splayed, testing the wall between worlds. The skin was fever-hot and damp, and for one heartbeat Ruth felt a pulse that was not Eula Mae's, steady and ancient and patient. "First one was perfect," Eula Mae whispered. "Pink and screaming and mine. Died in my arms before the afterbirth even come. After that I begged anything that would listen. Something listened." In the yard one of the graves cracked open with a sound like ice breaking on a pond. A small hand, grey-green and delicate as a frog's foot, pushed up through the clay, fingers curling toward the sound of its mother's voice. Soil rained from the wrist as it rose another inch, then paused, listening. Ruth's breath stopped in her throat. Eula Mae watched with the tender pride of any new mother and said, almost shyly, "They always come when I call." The pains began at dusk 3 nights later, sudden and rolling like thunder trapped under the ridge. Eula Mae had waited for them the way some women wait for trains, calm and certain they would arrive. She sent Ruth into the left-hand room with a single instruction spoken through clenched teeth: sweep the hearth clean and open every window, no matter how cold. Ruth obeyed, though the wind that came in smelled of iron and wet leaves and something older, like the inside of a mineshaft no one had entered since the war. The room had once been a birthing chamber and a dying chamber and everything in between. A rope bed sagged in one corner, mattress long since rotted to black lace. The floorboards were stained the color of dried liver in a wide, perfect circle, as though something had spilled there and kept spilling for years. In the center of that circle grew a single pale mushroom the size of a dinner plate, its gills glistening, its cap marked with a faint handprint. Eula Mae came in naked, moving with the heavy grace of a creature that has done this too many times to fear it. She knelt in the circle without ceremony, thighs spreading, hands braced on her knees. The contractions bent her forward until her forehead touched the floor, hair pooling like ink. Ruth knelt opposite, sterile gloves snapped on, heart hammering so hard she tasted metal. It happened fast. Too fast. The head crowned slick and dark, then the shoulders, then the body slid free in one long wet rush. No cry. No startled gasp. Only a soft exhalation that carried words Ruth had never heard and would never forget. The infant lay between its mother's knees, cord pulsing thick and black, skin the color of river silt after flood. Its chest rose once, slow, deliberate, the way a crocodile breathes when it wants you to think it's dead. Ruth reached for the cord with shaking scissors. The child turned its head, impossible, impossible, and looked straight at her. The eyes were filmed white, pupils faint as frost on glass, yet they saw. Its lips moved again, shaping the same backward phrase, syllables that tasted of grave dirt and lullabies. The tune was Cherokee, Ruth realized with the small sane part of her mind still working, an old death song her grandmother had forbidden anyone to sing near an open grave. She cut the cord. The moment the scissors closed, the baby's left hand crumbled. Not fell away, crumbled, fingers dissolving into grey-green dust that smelled of leaf mold and copper. The dust drifted upward instead of down, hanging in the air like pollen, then settled onto Eula Mae's thigh where it took root, sprouting tiny white threads that burrowed into her skin with a sound like kisses. Eula Mae gathered the child to her breast without looking at the ruin of its hand. Milk beaded black at her nipple and the infant latched with a greed that made Ruth's stomach turn. Over the small bare skull, Eula Mae met Ruth's eyes and smiled the way a mother smiles when the worst part is over and the real work can begin. "That's my good boy," she crooned, rocking. "Mama's got you now. You ain't never leaving again." The first one came at twilight, the color of a healing bruise, slipping out from under the rhododendron like a secret someone had forgotten to keep. Ruth saw it from the porch where she sat cleaning the birth blood from under her nails with a stick, because the water in the bucket had turned thick overnight and she no longer trusted it. The child moved on all fours, spine too long, head too heavy, skin hanging in loose folds that shifted when it breathed. Where its belly dragged the ground, pale mushrooms sprang up in its wake like breadcrumbs made of bone. It paused at the edge of the yard, lifting its face toward the house. The eyes were still filmed, but the mouth had learned something new. It opened and closed with the wet clicking of a moth against a lantern. Then it began to crawl toward the steps, leaving a dark wet trail that steamed faintly in the cold. Behind it, others followed. They came from every direction now, rising out of the graves with soft sucking sounds, pushing up through clay that parted for them like theater curtains. Some were fresher than others. The newest still had tufts of dark hair plastered to its skull. The oldest were mostly bone held together by black threads of fungus, joints clicking like knitting needles. They all moved the same way, deliberate, unhurried, drawn by the smell of milk and afterbirth that drifted from the open door. 7 in all, just as the stones had promised. They arranged themselves in the yard in a half-circle facing the porch, kneeling or crouching or simply collapsing forward onto their small ruined hands. None of them cried. None of them blinked. They only watched their mother with the patient hunger of things that have already died once and found it inconvenient. Eula Mae stepped out barefoot, wearing nothing but the same stained shift, belly already beginning to swell again though the birth had been less than an hour ago. She spread her arms wide and the children leaned toward her the way iron filings lean toward a magnet. A low sound rose from their throats, not words, not yet, only the wet beginning of language trying to remember its own name. Ruth stood frozen, scissors still in her pocket crusted with the 8th child's dust. She had delivered hundreds of babies and never once seen them return to the mother who bore them like this, obedient as shadows, beautiful as rot. Eula Mae walked down the steps into their midst. They pressed against her legs, small mouths rooting at her thighs, her calves, the hem of her dress. Where they touched, the cloth darkened and sagged, threads loosening as if something inside them fed on the idea of fabric itself. She stroked their heads, some soft with sparse hair, some slick with mold, some bare bone, and crooned the backward lullaby the newest had whispered at birth. One by one they turned their clouded eyes toward Ruth, and she understood with the sudden clarity of a woman stepping off a cliff that she was no longer the midwife here. She was the witness. Night had settled thick as felt over Dead Holler, the kind of dark that presses on the eyeballs and makes you doubt shapes. Ruth sat on the edge of the rope bed with her knees locked together, hands clamped between them to keep them from shaking loose. Across the room Eula Mae knelt among her children, letting them nurse at the black milk that beaded from her breasts like tar. They fed with the single-minded patience of leeches, small fingers kneading her skin until it bruised purple and yellow, colors that spread outward in the perfect outline of handprints. Ruth's voice, when it finally came, was scraped raw. "What did you trade?" Eula Mae didn't look up at first. She was busy stroking the skull of the oldest, the one whose face had mostly sloughed away, leaving only a suggestion of cheekbones and the small perfect teeth of a 5-year-old forever. When she spoke, it was soft, almost shy, the way a girl confesses her first kiss. "My loneliness," she said. That was all it wanted. She shifted, gathering the newest infant closer. The child's ruined hand had already begun to regrow, pale threads knitting bone from nothing, wrapping themselves into tiny translucent fingers that flexed and tested the air like a spider learning its legs. First baby came out screaming and then stopped. Eula Mae continued. Just stopped. Heart fluttered once more and was done. I held him till morning, begging anything that might be listening to give him back. Sun come up and the mountain answered. Not with words. With a feeling. Like something big leaned over the ridge and looked down at me the way you look at an anthill you're fixing to flood. She lifted her head then, eyes shining wet in the single candle's light. It said I could have children that would never leave me. Never grow up and marry some flatland girl and forget their mama. Never sicken, never stray. They'd be mine forever. All I had to do was let it in. Ruth tasted iron. She had bitten the inside of her cheek without noticing. Let it in where? Eula Mae smiled, and for the first time Ruth saw real teeth beneath the rot-stained enamel, too many, too sharp, arranged in a double row like a lamprey's kiss. Here, she said, and pressed both hands to her swollen belly. Beneath the skin something vast turned over, slow and satisfied, the way a sleeper turns toward warmth. And here. She touched the floorboards, where black roots had begun to thread up between the cracks, pulsing gently. And here. She gestured toward the children clustered around her, their clouded eyes fixed on Ruth with identical mild curiosity. The candle guttered though there was no wind. In the brief flare Ruth saw the truth plain. Eula Mae was not keeping the bargain. She was the bargain. The thing under the mountain had not taken her loneliness. It had moved into the space loneliness left behind, set up housekeeping, and begun to breed. Dawn came late and reluctant, a thin grey wash that barely reached the floor. Ruth had not slept. She had listened instead to the soft wet sounds of the children feeding, the slow drip of something thick from the ceiling onto the puncheon boards, the mountain itself breathing through the walls. When the light finally strengthened enough to see by, she noticed the tree. It grew straight up through the floor in the corner where the birthing circle was darkest, a pale trunk no thicker than a man's thigh, bark soft and spongy like the flesh of a mushroom. It had not been there yesterday, she would have sworn it on every oath she knew. Yet here it stood, pushing aside the boards with a patient violence, roots spreading beneath the surface like veins under skin. The leaves were wrong, broad, 5-lobed, the color of a drowned man's lips, and each one wept a slow, steady tear of black sap that smelled of afterbirth and coal dust. Ruth crept closer, drawn against every instinct. The trunk was warm, fever-warm, and when she laid her palm against it the whole thing shuddered, a full-body shiver that traveled down into the roots and up into the rafters. A pulse answered her touch, slow as a dying heart, but strong enough to rattle the tin cup on the shelf. Beneath the floorboards something answered back. She knelt, pried at a loose plank with fingers gone numb. It came up with a wet pop, revealing a hollow no deeper than a grave. At the bottom lay water, black and perfectly still, reflecting nothing. The tree's roots drank from it, thick cables that flexed and sucked with the deliberate rhythm of an umbilical cord. Every time they drew, the surface of the spring rippled outward in perfect circles, and in each circle Ruth saw a face, her own, Eula Mae's, the children's, mouths open in silent screams, eyes filmed white. From the hollow came a smell so concentrated it had weight, the smell of every placenta ever buried, every stillbirth wrapped in newspaper and laid under a lilac bush, every miscarriage flushed without ceremony. It coated the tongue, clung to the back of the throat, made the eyes water with recognition rather than pain. Eula Mae stood in the doorway watching, naked still, belly already rounding again though the last child lay curled at her feet gnawing softly on its own regrown fingers. Milk dripped from her breasts in slow black beads that hissed where they struck the floor and left tiny smoking craters. "You feel it now," she said, not a question. "The bargain's older than the coal in these hills. Older than the Cherokee, older than the Shawnee. The mountain was hollow once. Something filled it. Something that gets lonesome same as folks do." She stepped over the threshold and the tree leaned toward her, leaves trembling like a dog eager for its master's hand. One thick root lifted from the spring, questing blindly until it found her ankle. It rapped once, twice, gentle as a lover, and Eula Mae sighed the way a woman sighs when the ache finally eases. "It don't want much," she whispered. "Just a warm place to grow." Time lost its edges after that. Ruth measured it only by the swelling of Eula Mae's belly and the speed at which the children outgrew their own skins. They grew the way mushrooms do, in sudden violent bursts that left pieces of themselves behind like snakes shedding backward. A shoulder would split along a seam no one had noticed, revealing pale glistening flesh beneath, and the discarded layer would flutter to the floor still shaped like a child, still breathing for a few moments before it softened and spread. Where those cast-off skins landed, new growth pushed up overnight, pale stalks crowned with caps the size of supper plates, gills underneath etched with the faint, perfect whirl of a tiny ear or the curve of a miniature mouth frozen mid-cry. By the seventh morning the house was morel and cradle cap, floor carpeted thick with fruiting bodies that bruised black when stepped on and released clouds of dust that tasted of milk and pennies. The children moved among them like gardeners, breaking off pieces and pressing them to their own chests where they took root instantly, knitting fresh skin over bone that had already begun to yellow. They were taller now, some nearly to Ruth's waist, limbs too long and joints bending wrong, but the faces stayed infant-soft, cheeks round with the last of their baby fat even as mold threaded through the downy hair. At night they sang, if the wet clicking could be called singing, a backward lullaby that made the window panes sweat. Each voice was distinct yet layered, as though every child Eula Mae had ever carried spoke at once, the living and the half-living and the ones still waiting under her ribs. The sound crawled inside Ruth's skull and nested there, so that even when she clamped her hands over her ears she heard them counting her heartbeats, measuring how long she could still pretend to be separate. She tried to leave once, in the thin hour before dawn when the fog hung so low it licked the porch rails. She made it as far as the yard before the mushrooms closed ranks, stalks thickening into a pale fence that bent toward her with the lazy menace of cattails in current. One of the older children, the first, maybe, the one whose grave had opened widest, stood in her path wearing a smile too wide for its face. It held out a cap the size of a dinner plate. On the underside, pressed into the gills like a photograph in wet plaster, was Ruth's own sleeping face, mouth open, a spore already rooting in the corner of one eye. She backed away and the child let her go, but the message was gentle and final. The garden had chosen what it wanted to grow next. Inside, Eula Mae sat in the rocking chair stroking her belly and watching the ceiling where new roots had begun to thread through the chinking, questing downward like blind white worms. She looked radiant, swollen with more than pregnancy now, skin luminous and veined with black. "They're almost ready to go abroad," she said softly, pride and sorrow braided tight. "Soon as this one finishes, they'll walk down the trace and show the world what forever really means." Ruth waited until the moon was a thin scar behind the clouds and the children slept in their heap of cast-off skins, mouths slack, gills fluttering. She moved on knees gone soft from kneeling, gathering what she needed, the coal oil lamp, the tin of matches she had hidden inside her boot, the small bottle of ether she had never used on Eula Mae because the woman never once cried out. She poured the oil in a slow circle around the tree, soaking the spongy trunk until it drank greedily, bark darkening like a bruise. The roots under the floorboards pulsed faster, sensing something. She struck the first match. The flame caught with a soft hungry sound, blue at the base, then yellow, then a color Ruth had no name for. It ran along the oil in a perfect ring and leapt upward, wrapping the trunk in fire that did not crackle but sighed, the way lungs sigh when they finally give up. The tree shuddered, leaves curling black, sap boiling out in thick ropes that hissed and popped. For one heartbeat Ruth thought mercy might be that simple. Then the screaming began. Not from the children, they only watched with mild curiosity, heads tilted like birds, but from the fire itself. Every tongue of flame opened a mouth, tiny and perfect, infant lips parting around toothless gums. They wailed in the backward lullaby, voices high and thin and everywhere at once. The flames grew taller, stretching toward the roof, and where they touched the mushrooms the caps burst open, releasing clouds of dust that swirled upward instead of falling. Each mote of dust caught fire and became a spark with a face, a screaming mouth no bigger than a pinhead, eyes already filmed white. The air thickened with them. They poured from the burning tree like reverse rain, rising in a column that punched through the roof shingles and scattered across the night sky. Ruth stumbled back, coughing on smoke that tasted of milk and copper, watching the sparks drift over the ridge. Wherever they landed, on leaf, on moss, on the soft clay of the graves, they burrowed instantly, leaving tiny smoking holes that widened into mouths, then faces, then whole small bodies curling out of the ground like pale ferns. Behind her the tree split down the middle with a wet tearing sound. Black sap gushed out, thick as afterbirth, carrying things that wriggled. Eula Mae stood in the doorway, belly vast and low, hands cradling it as if the fire were only a summer storm. The flames did not touch her. They bent away, bowing. "You can't burn what's already rooted," she said, almost tender. "Fire just helps it travel." One of the sparks landed on Ruth's wrist. It did not burn at first, only clung, warm and wet. Then it burrowed, a quick bright pain like a needle sliding home. She looked down and saw the skin already puckering, a tiny mouth opening beneath the surface, whispering her name backward. She understood then that the mountain had never needed Eula Mae to birth its children one at a time. It only needed a way to scatter the seeds. The fire settled into a steady glow, more hearth than inferno, as though the house had decided burning was simply another way to breathe. Ruth stood in the yard with the children circling her like slow pale moths, their mouths open to taste the smoke that carried pieces of their siblings. Her wrist itched where the spark had entered. Beneath the skin something turned over, patient, learning the shape of her pulse. Eula Mae walked out last, barefoot across the embers without flinching. Her belly had grown monstrous in the hours since the flames began, stretched so tight the skin shone translucent, black veins mapping continents beneath. She stopped at the edge of the porch and looked up at the ridge where the oldest coal mines gaped like broken teeth. The mountain answered with a low rumble that was not thunder, a shifting of weight deep inside stone. Ruth saw it then, the truth that had been waiting under every other truth. Eula Mae was not the mother of rot. She was its womb, nothing more. The thing that lived beneath the ridge had worn her the way a fungus wears a log, hollowing her out year by year, filling the hollow with itself. The children, the tree, the black spring, the spores riding the night wind, they were only the first soft fruits. The real birth was coming now, and it needed more room than any human body could give. Eula Mae sank to her knees in the smoldering yard. The children gathered close, pressing their faces to her thighs, her back, her swollen sides, mouths rooting gently as if to comfort. Her spine bowed backward until the vertebrae showed white through the skin, and the belly split along a seam no one had seen before. Not with blood, but with dark water that poured out steaming, carrying pale threads and blind eyes and things that had never been given names. The ground softened beneath her, clay turning to black mud that opened like a mouth. Roots thicker than a man's torso rose up through the yard, wrapping Eula Mae's legs, her waist, her throat, pulling her down with the tender certainty of a lover guiding a bride across a threshold. She did not scream. She smiled, eyes filmed white at last, and reached one hand toward Ruth in something that might have been farewell or invitation. The mountain groaned again, louder, a long exhalation of stone and coal dust and centuries of patience. Cracks spidered across the ridge, glowing faintly with the same corpse light that had lived in the graves. From those cracks poured more of the dark water, more roots, more children, some no bigger than acorns, some already taller than Ruth, all singing the backward song in perfect, terrible harmony. The last thing Ruth saw before the mud took her feet was Eula Mae disappearing into the earth, belly folding inward like a flower closing at dawn, becoming the doorway instead of the child. Then the ground rose up gentle and warm and closed over her head, and she understood that the mountain had been pregnant longer than any woman could bear. It was ready to deliver the world.